On the night of September 7, 1996, a black BMW 750IL rolled slowly through the Las Vegas Strip. In the passenger seat sat a 25-year-old man whose face was recognized in every city in America. His name was Tupac Amaru Shakur. Behind the wheel was Marion Suge Knight, the 6'3", 300-pound co-founder of Death Row Records, the most powerful hip-hop label on the West Coast. They had just left the MGM Grand Garden Arena, where Mike Tyson had knocked out Bruce Seldon in the first round. The night felt electric. Las Vegas was full. The streets were thick with traffic and noise and people who had nowhere particular to be. The BMW stopped at a red light at the intersection of Flamingo Road and Koval Lane. A white Cadillac pulled alongside. A rear window came down. A hand extended with a semi-automatic pistol. 13 rounds were fired into the BMW. 4 of them struck Tupac Shakur. 1 round hit him in the chest, another in his right hand, another in his pelvis. Suge Knight was grazed by a bullet fragment or shattered glass, depending on the account. He was not seriously injured. He drove the bullet-riddled BMW to the nearest intersection and flagged down police. Shakur was rushed to University Medical Center. He was placed in a medically induced coma. Over the next 6 days, doctors performed multiple surgeries, including the removal of his right lung. His mother, Afeni Shakur, flew to Las Vegas and remained at his bedside. On September 13, 1996, Tupac Amaru Shakur died of internal bleeding caused by the gunshot wounds. He was 25 years old. His death was announced to a nation that had watched through the lens of tabloid media and music journalism, as the conflict that killed him had escalated for 2 years. Some mourned. Some pointed to the violence of his lyrics as if they were a confession rather than a warning. Very few asked the question that mattered most: who had built the system that made this killing inevitable? 6 months later, on the night of March 9, 1997, a black Chevrolet Suburban idled at a red light at the corner of Wilshire Boulevard and South Fairfax Avenue in Los Angeles. In the front passenger seat was Christopher George Latour Wallace, known to the world as the notorious B.I.G., known to the streets as Biggie Smalls. He was 24. A dark Chevrolet Impala SS pulled alongside. The driver, a black man in a light blue suit and bow tie, lowered the window and fired 6 shots from a 9mm pistol. 4 struck Wallace. 1 entered through his right hip and traveled upward through his colon, liver, heart, and left lung. The other 3 wounds, to his left forearm, his back, and his left thigh, were survivable. The one that mattered was not. His entourage rushed him to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Doctors performed an emergency thoracotomy, opening his chest in a desperate attempt to repair the damage. It was not enough. Christopher George Latour Wallace was pronounced dead at 1:15 in the morning on March 9, 1997. He was 24 years old. His second album, Life After Death, a double-disc masterwork that many consider the finest hip-hop album ever recorded, was 16 days from its release date. The title, chosen months earlier, had become a prophecy. News of his death traveled instantly. Radio stations looped his music. Vigils formed in Brooklyn, where he had grown up on St. James Place in the Clinton Hill neighborhood. Vigils formed in Los Angeles, where he had been killed. For the second time in 6 months, a superstar rapper had been murdered by drive-by shooting. For the second time, the shooter had disappeared into the night without a trace. 2 young men, 2 drive-by shootings, 2 unsolved murders that would haunt American culture for nearly 3 decades. But this is not a story about hip-hop. It is a story about what happens when criminal organizations embed themselves into legitimate industries, when gang politics become business strategy, when the line between the boardroom and the street corner is erased not by accident, but by design. To understand how 2 of the most famous musicians in the world were killed in circumstances that resembled contract hits, you have to understand the world that made those killings possible. And that world was not built in recording studios. It was built on the streets of Compton, California, decades before anyone involved ever touched a microphone. Compton sits roughly 10 miles south of downtown Los Angeles. By the early 1970s, It had become one of the most economically devastated cities in Southern California. White flight and deindustrialization hollowed out the tax base. Factories closed, schools lost funding. The neighborhoods that remained were populated largely by Black and Latino families who had been excluded from the suburban prosperity that surrounded them on all sides. The crack-cocaine epidemic of the 1980s finished what deindustrialization had started. Crack was cheap to produce, easy to distribute, and enormously addictive. It introduced staggering amounts of cash into communities that had no banks willing to serve them and no legal economy capable of absorbing the money. A teenager on a street corner could make more in a week than his mother made in a month. The economics were simple. The consequences were not. Addiction rates soared. Families disintegrated. Violent crime exploded. The federal government responded with mandatory minimums and militarized policing. It filled prisons. It did not fix neighborhoods. The drug trade became the local economy. The gangs that controlled the drug trade became the local government. They provided employment, protection, and a sense of belonging in communities where every other institution had failed. The price was obedience. The penalty for disobedience was death. None of this made national news. It was simply the way things were. Two gang alliances dominated Los Angeles County during this period. The Crips, formed in the late 1960s, had grown into a sprawling network of independent sets spread across the city. The Bloods, formed in the early 1970s as a response to Crip expansion, organized themselves along similar lines. These were not monolithic organizations with a single chain of command. They were loose federations of neighborhood sets, each with its own leadership, its own territory, its own rules. But they were bound together by colors, codes, and a shared willingness to use extreme violence to enforce their claims. Among the blood sets in Compton, one of the most prominent was the Mob Piru Bloods, based on the east side of the city. Their territory was small. Their reputation was not. Among the Crip sets, the South Side Compton Crips operated in overlapping territory. These two groups had been in conflict for years, trading shootings and retaliations across a landscape where a wrong turn onto the wrong block could be fatal. This was the environment that produced the key players in what would become the most consequential criminal conspiracy in the history of the American music industry. Marion Hugh Knight Jr. grew up on the east side of Compton. He attended Linwood High School, where he played football and track. He was big. He was aggressive. He was, by multiple accounts, intelligent enough to see that the street life around him could be leveraged into something larger. Knight was affiliated with the Mob Piru Bloods. The nature of that affiliation has been debated. Some who knew him have said he was not a traditional gang member, but rather someone who used the gang's muscle and reputation as tools for his own ambitions. Others have said his ties were deeper than that. In 2008, during a law enforcement crackdown in Compton, police officially named Knight as one of approximately 200 members of the Mob Piru. What is not disputed is that Knight understood something fundamental about the relationship between fear and commerce. He understood that in the entertainment industry, where contracts are negotiated and deals are made between people who often have no legal recourse against each other, the ability to project physical menace was a form of currency, and he spent it freely. Before Death Row Records existed, Knight worked as a bodyguard for celebrities, including singer Bobby Brown. He observed, at close range, how the music industry operated. He saw the money. He saw the vulnerability of artists who had no protection. He saw the gap between the people who created value and the people who captured it. In 1991, Knight co-founded Death Row Records with Dr. Dre, the DEOC, and music executive Dick Griffey. The startup capital, reportedly $1.5 million, came from Michael Harry O. Harris, a convicted drug lord with ties to the Bounty Hunter Bloods, a gang based in the Watts section of Los Angeles. Harris was serving a 28-year sentence for attempted murder and drug trafficking at the time. The money that launched the label that would dominate hip-hop came directly from the proceeds of the drug trade. From the beginning, Death Row Records was not merely a record label that happened to have gang members on the payroll. It was a record label that functioned, in significant ways, like a gang. Knight staffed the label with Mob Piru members. They served as security. They served as enforcers. They served as a visible reminder to anyone who interacted with the label that behind the music was something much more dangerous. The business model was straightforward. Death Row would sign talented artists, many of them from the streets themselves, and produce commercially successful albums. The music was the product. The gang was the infrastructure. The fear was the insurance policy. And for a time, it worked spectacularly well. Dr. Dre's The Chronic, released in 1992, sold over 6 million copies. Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style, released in 1993, debuted at number 1. At its peak, Death Row Records generated over $100 million in annual revenue. It was, by any measure, one of the most successful independent record labels in American history. But the violence was never far from the surface. Allegations mounted that Knight used intimidation and physical force in his business dealings. There are accounts, some disputed and some corroborated by multiple witnesses, of Knight threatening artists, managers, and industry executives. One widely reported incident involves the rapper Vanilla Ice, who has stated publicly that Knight dangled him over a balcony on the 15th floor of a hotel to compel him to sign over publishing rights to a song. The money from that deal reportedly helped fund Death Row's early operations. The label also maintained a nightclub in Las Vegas called Club 662. The name was a coded reference. On a telephone keypad, 662 spells MOB, the abbreviation for Member of Bloods. The club served as a social hub for Death Row artists and associates. It was also the destination Tupac Shakur and Suge Knight were driving toward on the night Shakur was shot. At the time, none of this seemed unusual. A record label with gang ties was just another fact of life in an industry that had always attracted people who operated outside the law. It would only make sense later, when the bodies started falling. In October 1995, Suge Knight posted $1.4 million in bail to free Tupac Shakur from a New York prison, where the rapper was serving a sentence for sexual abuse. The bail came with conditions. Shakur would sign with Death Row Records. He would record exclusively for the label. He would, in effect, become the property of Suge Knight's empire. Shakur agreed. The reasons were partly financial and partly emotional. He needed the money. He needed the freedom. And he needed, or believed he needed, the protection that came with being associated with the most feared man in the music industry. But the protection came at a cost. When Shakur joined Death Row, he also entered the orbit of the Mob Piru Bloods. He began associating with gang members. He got a tattoo that read MOB on his right arm. According to James McDonald, a Mob Piru member who served as security for Death Row, the ordinary rules of gang initiation did not apply to Shakur because of his money and fame. But Shakur behaved as though he were part of the gang nonetheless. McDonald later said he was troubled by this. He believed Shakur was playing a dangerous game, adopting the posture of a gang member without fully understanding the consequences. Those consequences would arrive with devastating speed. On the East Coast, a parallel power structure had formed around Sean Puffy Combs and his label, Bad Boy Records. Combs, who would later be known as P. Diddy and then simply Diddy, had built Bad Boy into a commercial juggernaut, largely on the strength of one artist, Christopher Wallace, the notorious B.I.G. The relationship between East Coast and West Coast hip-hop had been competitive but not violent for most of the early 1990s. Tupac and Biggie had been friends. They respected each other's work. They had, by several accounts, genuine affection for one another. But the music industry's appetite for conflict, combined with real grievances and the involvement of people whose primary loyalty was not to music but to the streets, turned that competition into something far more dangerous. The fracture point came on November 30th, 1994. Tupac Shakur arrived at Quad Recording Studios in Manhattan to record a guest verse for a session arranged by a mutual associate. As he entered the lobby, he was ambushed. He was shot 5 times, hit in the head, groin, and hand. He was robbed of jewelry worth an estimated $40,000. Remarkably, he survived. He checked himself out of the hospital the following day. The next night, bandaged and in a wheelchair, he appeared in court for sentencing on the sexual abuse charge. The image of Shakur, defiant and wounded, became one of the defining photographs of 1990s hip-hop. Shakur believed, though this was never proven and has been vigorously disputed, that Biggie and Combs had prior knowledge of the attack or were somehow involved. He noted that when he arrived at Quad Studios, the people who shot him seemed to know exactly where he would be and when. He noted that Biggie and members of the Bad Boy entourage were in the building at the time of the shooting. Upstairs in the same studio, Combs and Wallace denied any involvement. They expressed shock. They said they had no idea what had happened until after the fact. No one was ever charged in the Quad Studio shooting. The truth of what happened that night remains unknown, but the accusation, once made, could not be retracted. It metastasized. It became the foundation of a feud that the media framed as East Coast versus West Coast, but that was, in reality, something more specific and more dangerous. It was a conflict between two record labels that had allowed criminal organizations to become embedded in their operations, and the people caught in the middle were the artists whose talent had made the money possible in the first place. Seen from a distance, each incident looked like an isolated dispute, a studio robbery here, a shouting match there, a diss track that went too far. But taken together, they formed something else entirely. The violence escalated through 1995 and 1996. At the Source Awards in August 1995, Suge Knight publicly insulted Sean Combs from the stage, mocking his involvement in his artist's music and inviting anyone who wanted to make records without their label boss appearing in their videos to come to death row. It was a calculated provocation delivered in front of the entire hip-hop industry. It drew a clear line. On September 24, 1995, at Jermaine Dupri's birthday party at the Platinum House nightclub in Atlanta, members of Bad Boy's entourage clashed with Knight and his associates. During the altercation, Jai Hassan Jamal Robles, a Campanella Park Piru Bloods member who served as a death row bodyguard, was fatally shot. The attorneys for Combs and his bodyguard denied any involvement. The case remains officially unresolved. Tupac, meanwhile, released Hit 'Em Up, widely considered one of the most aggressive diss tracks in hip-hop history. In it, he named Biggie directly, made explicit claims about Wallace's wife, and declared war on the entire Bad Boy roster. The track was not merely a song, it was a public threat, delivered with the full weight of Death Row's reputation behind it. In July 1996, a group of South Side Compton Crips attempted to rob Trevon Tree Lane, a Mob Piru member and Death Row associate, at a Foot Locker store in the Lakewood Center Mall in Lakewood, California. Among the Crips involved was Orlando Anderson, a young member of the South Side set, and the nephew of Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, a senior figure in the gang. The robbery attempt failed, but it established a personal grievance between the Mob Piru and the South Side Crips that would prove fatal. On the night of September 7, 1996, after the Tyson fight at the MGM Grand, Tupac Shakur and Suge Knight's entourage spotted Orlando Anderson in the hotel lobby. It was Trayvon Lane who first recognized Anderson. He pointed him out to Shakur. What followed was captured on the hotel's surveillance cameras and would become some of the most analyzed security footage in criminal history. Shakur approached Anderson and struck him. Mob Piru members joined in. Anderson was knocked to the ground and beaten by multiple assailants. Hotel security intervened within seconds. The attack lasted less than a minute. Anderson did not fight back. He later told investigators he did not know why he had been attacked. This was not true. He knew exactly why. In the calculus of gang warfare, what happened next was predictable. An attack on a member of the South Side Compton Crips, carried out in public, on camera, by members of an opposing gang, demanded a response. The response did not require authorization from a central command. It did not require a formal meeting or a vote. It required only the presence of armed men with a motive and an opportunity. Both materialized within hours, according to accounts that have emerged over the following decades. Keefe D., Orlando Anderson, and two other South Side Crips, Terrence T. Brown and DeAndre Dre Smith, got into a white Cadillac and drove toward Club 662, where they expected Shakur and Knight to arrive for a party that night. James McDonald, the Mob Piru member working security that evening, later stated that he was posted in the parking lot of Club 662 and saw the white Cadillac with South Side Crips inside. He called his brother, Alton, and warned him that the South Side was present. For reasons that have never been fully explained, the warning was not acted upon. The death row entourage proceeded along the Las Vegas Strip as if nothing had changed. They found the BMW at the intersection of Flamingo Road and Koval Lane, stopped at a red light. What happened in the next few seconds ended one life and shaped the course of an industry. Keefe D has stated in interviews, in a memoir he published in 2019, and in a proffer session with law enforcement in 2008, that he was in the front passenger seat of the Cadillac. He stated that the two men in the back seat were Anderson and Smith. He stated that the driver was Brown. He declined, initially, to identify the shooter, citing what he called street code. The implication of his accounts, combined with other evidence, pointed to the back seat. All three of the other men in that Cadillac are now dead. Brown and Smith died in subsequent years. Anderson was killed in an unrelated gang shootout in Compton in 1998 at the age of 23. He was never charged with Shakur's murder. He denied involvement until his death. Keefe D is now the only surviving occupant of that vehicle. On September 29, 2023, 27 years after the shooting, he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder for the killing of Tupac Shakur. He pleaded not guilty. His trial, after multiple delays, is currently scheduled to begin on August 10, 2026 in Clark County, Nevada. There is another layer to this story, one that remains contested but that has been repeated with increasing specificity over the years. In his 2008 proffer session with a joint federal and Los Angeles police task force, Keefe D made a claim that, if true, would implicate one of the most powerful figures in the music industry in the murder of Tupac Shakur. He alleged that Sean Combs, the head of Bad Boy Records, had offered a bounty of $1 million for the deaths of Suge Knight and Tupac Shakur. According to Keefe D's account, Combs made this offer at a gathering attended by members of the South Side Compton Crips. He allegedly said words to the effect that he would give anything for their heads. Keefe D has repeated this claim in media interviews, in his memoir, and most recently in the 2025 Netflix documentary, Sean Combs: The Reckoning. He has also stated that the $1 million was never actually paid. Combs has consistently and forcefully denied any involvement in Shakur's murder. He has never been charged. He has never been named as a suspect by the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. In a 2008 interview, Combs called the allegations beyond ridiculous and completely false. Whether these claims will be tested in court during Keefe D's upcoming trial remains to be seen. What is documented, and what is not in dispute, is that the murder of Tupac Shakur was the product of a system in which criminal organizations and the music industry had become so deeply intertwined that a fistfight in a hotel lobby could trigger a fatal drive-by shooting within hours. The structures that made this possible were not accidental. They were built, maintained, and enforced by people who understood that violence was a business tool, and the bill for that business was about to come due a second time. The murder of Christopher Wallace 6 months later followed a different trajectory, but emerged from the same ecosystem. In February 1997, Wallace traveled to Los Angeles to promote his upcoming second album, Life After Death, and to film a music video. The city was still raw from Shakur's killing. The East Coast-West Coast feud was at its most dangerous. Wallace knew the risks. In a radio interview on March 5th, he told San Francisco's KYLD that he had hired security because he feared for his safety, but he did not leave. Leaving would have meant admitting fear. And in the world he inhabited, fear was a currency he could not afford to show. So he stayed. He went to parties. He sat in cars with the windows down. He moved through a city that had killed his rival 6 months earlier, as though the rules did not apply to him. Perhaps he believed they did not. Perhaps he simply had no choice. On the night of March 8th, Wallace attended a party hosted by Vibe Magazine, Quest Records, and Tanqueray at the Peterson Automotive Museum on Wilshire Boulevard. Sean Combs was there. The bad boy entourage was there. The streets outside were crowded. Shortly after midnight, the party ended and the crowd began to disperse. Wallace got into a black Chevrolet Suburban. Combs rode in a separate vehicle ahead. The convoy pulled west on Wilshire at the intersection of South Fairfax Avenue. The scene that opened this story repeated itself in mirror image. A dark car, a rolled down window, gunfire. Wallace was dead within the hour. The case has never been solved. No one has ever been arrested. No one has ever been charged. The investigation, which has been repeatedly opened and closed and reopened over nearly 3 decades, has produced more theories than answers. The most prominent theory, advanced by retired LAPD Detective Russell Poole, alleged that Suge Knight conspired with corrupt LAPD officer David Mack to orchestrate Wallace's murder. Poole believed that Amir Muhammad, an associate of Mack's, was the triggerman. This theory gained significant public attention through journalist Randall Sullivan's 2002 book Labyrinth and a subsequent documentary. However, the key informant behind much of this theory, known as Psycho Mike, later admitted that his account was based on hearsay rather than direct knowledge. The theory was never proven. That might have been the end of it. But in cases like this, the absence of an answer does not produce acceptance. It produces more questions. A second theory, advanced by retired LAPD Detective Greg Kading, who worked on the case as part of a gang task force, alleged that Knight orchestrated Wallace's murder from jail as a retaliation for Shakur's killing. Kading has stated publicly that he believes the case is solved but unprosecuted. According to Kading's account, Knight communicated through an intermediary, a woman who visited him in the county jail under the pretense of being a legal assistant, which allowed her unmonitored visits. Through this intermediary, Knight allegedly arranged for Wardell Poochie Fowles, a Mob Piru member, to carry out the killing. The LAPD and FBI reportedly took the intermediary's statement in 2009 on the condition that her identity remain private. Faust was shot dead in Compton on July 24, 2003 while riding his motorcycle. He was shot in the back. No one was ever convicted for his murder. Knight has never been charged in connection with Wallace's death. He is currently serving a 28-year sentence in a California state prison for an unrelated voluntary manslaughter conviction stemming from a fatal 2015 hit and run. He is eligible for parole in 2034. Wallace's family pursued justice through the civil courts. In 2002, his mother, Valletta Wallace, filed a wrongful death claim against the city of Los Angeles, alleging LAPD involvement and obstruction. The first trial ended in a mistrial after it was discovered that key evidence had been deliberately withheld from the Wallace family's legal team. A second lawsuit, filed in 2007 for $400 million, was eventually dismissed. Valletta Wallace died on February 21, 2025. She spent nearly 28 years seeking answers about her son's murder. She never received them. The case remains officially open. The LAPD continues to describe it as actively investigated. The intersection of Wilshire and Fairfax, where Wallace was killed, is now a quiet stretch of mid-city Los Angeles. The Peterson Automotive Museum still stands. Most of the people who visit it have no idea what happened on its curb at 12:45 in the morning, nearly 3 decades ago. What made these murders possible was not merely the actions of individuals. It was the architecture of a system. The relationship between Death Row Records and the Mob Piru Bloods was symbiotic but inherently unstable. Gang members expected compensation that went beyond what the label was willing or able to provide. Artists who were signed under duress or intimidation chafed against contracts they had no power to renegotiate, and the very qualities that made the label fearsome, its willingness to use violence, its connections to the streets, made it a target for law enforcement, rival gangs, and its own internal contradictions. Bad Boy Records, on the other side, operated with more corporate polish, but was not immune to the same dynamics. While Combs presented himself as a legitimate businessman Allegations have persisted for decades that Bad Boy maintained its own connections to street-level criminal organizations. The extent of those connections remains a matter of dispute. What is not disputed is that both labels operated in an environment where the boundary between entertainment and organized crime was, at best, porous. The East Coast-West Coast feud was, at its core, a turf war. It was fought using the language and infrastructure of the music industry, through diss tracks and magazine covers and awards show provocations. But its underlying logic was the same as any gang conflict. It was about territory, about reputation, about the willingness to use force to defend both. The artists were the public face of the conflict. The gang members were the machinery behind it, and the executives. The men who controlled the money and the contracts and the business relationships were the ones who had the most to gain from keeping the conflict alive and the most to lose from letting it spiral out of control. They failed on the second count. What followed was not a single catastrophe. It was a slow unraveling. The consequences extended far beyond the two men who were killed. In the years following the murders, a cascade of violence swept through the communities connected to Death Row Records and the South Side Compton Crips. The Mob Piru and the South Side Crips went to war. The retaliation for Shakur's death was not a single act, but a sustained campaign. According to James McDonald, the Mob Piru felt compelled to respond because Shakur, though not a formal member, had been killed on their watch. Their credibility demanded retaliation. Multiple people connected to Death Row Records were killed in the years that followed, victims of gang rivalries that had been inflamed by the label's entanglement with the streets. Alton Buntry McDonald, a close friend of Suge Knight and a Mob Piru member, was shot dead on April 3, 2002. Henry Hendog Smith, who designed the Death Row Records logo, was shot dead on October 16, 2002. And Wardell Poochie Fouse, the man Kading identified as Biggie's killer, was himself gunned down the following year. These deaths received little national attention. They were, in the media's calculus, ordinary gang violence, indistinguishable from the thousands of other shootings that occurred in Los Angeles during those years. But they were not ordinary. They were the aftershocks of an earthquake that had been building for years, fueled by money, fame, and the systematic failure of institutions to recognize what was happening until it was too late. Death Row Records filed for bankruptcy in 2006. It was auctioned off for $18 million in 2009, a fraction of what it had once earned in a single year. Suge Knight's personal finances collapsed in parallel. Bankruptcy documents filed in 2006 showed he had $11 in his bank account, clothing worth $1,000, and jewelry worth $25,000. The man who had once been the most feared figure in the music industry was, by any financial measure, ruined. Law enforcement's response to the murders of Shakur and Wallace has been, by almost any standard, a failure. The Shakur case went unsolved for 27 years. The Wallace case remains unsolved after nearly 28. The reasons for this are multiple and interconnected. In the Shakur case, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department faced a wall of silence. Witnesses were uncooperative. The gang code that prevented cooperation with police was deeply embedded in the communities where the relevant information existed. The key suspects, Orlando Anderson and the other occupants of the white Cadillac, were either dead or unwilling to talk. Keefe D began making public statements about his involvement years later, first in media interviews, then in a 2018 documentary, and then in a memoir published in 2019. His willingness to speak publicly, combined with the details he provided, eventually reinvigorated the investigation. In 2023, the Las Vegas police executed a search warrant at the Henderson, Nevada, home of Keefe D's wife. Keefe D was arrested on September 29, 2023, and charged with first-degree murder. The case against him relies heavily on his own statements, including his 2008 proffer session, his media appearances, and his memoir titled Compton Street Legend. His defense team has argued that these statements were made for entertainment purposes and should not be treated as confessions. They have also filed motions to suppress evidence obtained from what they describe as an unlawful nighttime search in 2023, and have raised the possibility that someone else orchestrated the killing. The defense has specifically pointed to Reggie Wright Jr., who ran security for Death Row Records, as an alternative suspect. Wright has not been charged. In the Wallace case, the LAPD's investigation was plagued by allegations of corruption, incompetence, and deliberate obstruction. The Rampart Division scandal, which exposed widespread corruption among LAPD officers, including drug dealing, evidence planting, and connections to gang activity, cast a shadow over the investigation. Officers David Mack and Rafael Perez, both implicated in the Rampart scandal, were at various points suspected of involvement in Wallace's murder. Mack was convicted of robbing a Bank of America branch of $722,000. His connections to Death Row Records and the Mob Piru added fuel to theories that corrupt officers had facilitated the killing. The FBI investigated these connections but was, according to former agent Phil Carson, stymied by the fear that potential cooperators had of Mack. The investigation produced leads but no charges. In December 2012, the LAPD released Wallace's autopsy report, 15 years after his death. In an effort to generate new leads, the Wallace family was not notified before the release. The department apologized. The family was not impressed. Every few years, a new theory would surface, a new documentary would air, a new witness would come forward or recant, and the case would remain exactly where it had always been: open, active, unsolved. As of early 2026, the state of the two cases is as follows. Keith D's trial, after multiple delays and changes in his defense team, is now scheduled for August 2026. He remains incarcerated at Nevada's High Desert State Prison, serving both pretrial detention and a separate sentence of 16 to 40 months for a jailhouse fight. The discovery material has been described by his attorneys as voluminous. When the trial occurs, it will be the first criminal proceeding directly connected to Tupac Shakur's murder. In the Wallace case, there is no defendant, no trial date, and no apparent prospect of prosecution. The primary suspects identified by investigators are dead. Knight remains in prison. The LAPD describes the case as open but has made no new arrests. In December 2025, the Netflix documentary Sean Combs: The Reckoning, executive produced by Curtis 50 Cent Jackson, presented previously unseen material related to both cases, including Keith D's proffer session audio and archival LAPD materials. The documentary alleged that Combs played a role in facilitating the conditions that led to Shakur's death and may have been indirectly responsible for Wallace's death by keeping the rapper in Los Angeles despite known threats. Combs' legal team has called the documentary biased and designed to sway public opinion. What remains after the trials and the theories and the documentaries and the decades is the damage. Tupac Shakur and Christopher Wallace were not statistics. They were artists who translated the conditions of their upbringing into work that millions of people recognized as truth. Tupac Shakur sold over 75 million records worldwide. He was and remains one of the most influential artists in the history of recorded music. His lyrics address poverty, racism, police brutality, and the internal contradictions of a young man who wanted to change the world but could not escape the world he came from. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2017, 21 years after his death. Christopher Wallace sold over 28 million records. His debut album, Ready to Die, and his posthumous double album, Life After Death, are widely regarded as two of the greatest hip-hop albums ever produced. His influence on subsequent generations of artists, from Jay-Z to Eminem to Kendrick Lamar, is difficult to overstate. The album debuted at number 1, a final testament to the talent that had been extinguished on a Los Angeles street corner. The communities that produced these men continue to bear the weight of their loss. Compton is still Compton. The gangs are still there. The violence has diminished in some areas, but the underlying conditions, the poverty, the lack of investment, the absence of legitimate pathways to prosperity, persist. The families of the victims have spent decades seeking answers that may never come. Voletta Wallace, who died in February 2025 after filing 2 wrongful death lawsuits and spending nearly 28 years demanding accountability, never learned the official identity of her son's killer. Afeni Shakur, Tupac's mother, died in 2016 without seeing anyone held accountable for her son's murder. She had spent the last 2 decades of her life managing her son's estate and legacy, ensuring that his art survived even as the search for his killer stalled. The music industry moved on. It absorbed the lessons of death row's rise and fall, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of organized crime, but as a business case study in branding and market positioning. The gangsta aesthetic, stripped of its real-world consequences, became a commodity that could be packaged and sold without risk to anyone in the corporate offices. Record labels continued to sign artists from the streets. They continued to profit from narratives of violence and criminality. They simply became more careful about maintaining distance between the boardroom and the consequences, and the men who pulled the triggers, who drove the cars, who arranged the meetings and passed the weapons. They are mostly dead now. The ones who are alive are in prison or awaiting trial. The structures that made their actions possible have not been dismantled. They have been renamed, reorganized, and adapted. The drugs still flow through the same neighborhoods. The gangs still recruit from the same schools. The silence still holds in the same communities where speaking to law enforcement remains, for many, an act more dangerous than the crimes they would be reporting. The question that hangs over both cases is not who did it. At this point, investigators believe they know, at least in broad terms, who was responsible for each killing. The question is why the system that produced these murders was allowed to function for so long, why so many people who had the power to intervene chose not to, and what that silence cost. The answer is the same answer that applies to every story about organized crime, from the Sicilian Mafia to the Mexican cartels to the street gangs of South Los Angeles. Silence is not the absence of knowledge. Silence is a choice. It is a choice made by people who have something to protect, whether that is money, power, reputation, or simply the ability to wake up in the morning without fear. The people who could have spoken did not speak. The institutions that could have acted did not act. And 2 young men, both of whom had used their voices to describe the world as it was, were silenced permanently. That is the cost. That is always the cost. The empires rise. The empires fall. The silence remains. And it always costs more lives than anyone is willing to count.